Erik Duane here from ETEC 551, conducting a research review and a critique of the article Learning and Educational Computer Games for Novices, the Impact of Support Provision Types of Virtual Presence, Cognitive Load, and Learning Outcomes. Now this research and article were conducted by Claudia Schrader and Theo Bastiaens from the Fern University in Hagen, Germany. Now, I'm going to be providing you an enormous amount of information in a very short period of time, so if at any point you need to stop the video so that you can read any of the slides, please, by all means, do. Why study this? Well, there's a serious impact on the students, for one. So we want to study this information. We want to look at how these types of things can impact our students, the types of support. What are the types of support? Well, you have no support, of course, but you have intrinsic support and extrinsic support. Now, intrinsic support is in-game type help. It may be a guide in the game, it might be directions, things that give you prompts and immediate feedback when you're performing various tasks in the game. And the extrinsic support is along the lines of a hyperlink within the game that leads students to an external resource so that they can learn more about the things they need to know in order to complete the tasks in the game. The researchers asked two important questions. First, they take a look at the three criteria of study: virtual presence, cognitive load, and learning outcomes. And they want to see if there is a significant difference between these areas for students who have support and those who don't. And then the second question they want to know is which type of support is better, intrinsic or extrinsic. Now, there are no clearly stated hypotheses in this. More on this later in my critique. Based on these two research questions and the conclusions that were found at the end of the research, I came up with these hypotheses, and you can see them for yourself. Let's talk about the method they used in the research. First, we'll cover the participants. Now, they used 138 8th grade students from middle school in Germany who were specifically selected for their lack of knowledge on physics and their lack of familiarity with the learning game that was employed, which was Electra. Then they were randomly distributed or assigned to 3 subgroups. Let's take a look at the gaming environment that the researchers employed. As you can see here, they used a game that was widely accepted by the European Commission that was color 3D. They used it to teach a module on physics, and they broke it down into 3 separate groups: conventional, with no support, and then the 2 subsequent extrinsic and intrinsic support models. Here's a screenshot that gives you an idea of what no support looks like. This is what the extrinsic support model looks like. In the lower left corner, you can see that there's an external textbook that's open and being reviewed. This is the intrinsic support model. As you can see in the lower left corner, there is a guide or a sage with which the student can refer to get in-game prompts, feedback, or information. Let's discuss the measurement instruments that they use for this research. First, they took a pre-game background questionnaire on the topic. Following usage of the game, they were given a virtual presence questionnaire, a cognitive load questionnaire, and a learning outcomes questionnaire. This explains how they carried out the procedure. Let's take a look at the results based on the hypotheses that I drew from the article. H1 was confirmed, and as you can see here, it means that those who did not use any type of support whatsoever had a higher virtual presence in the game. That was followed by those who used intrinsic support, and then those who used extrinsic support last, as far as the virtual presence model was concerned. Looking at the results on these hypotheses, we can see that cognitive load was basically the same for all 3 versions of the game, and hypothesis 3 was partially confirmed. They discovered that learners with access to any support device had significantly higher test scores in retention, comprehension, and near transfer compared to those who played the conventional game, the game without support. However, they could not determine whether the same outcomes existed in far transfer. Hypothesis 4 was partially supported, so they determined that either game, extrinsic or intrinsic support, felt similar levels of cognitive load, and neither one was superior to the other. Hypothesis 5 was not supported. Neither the extrinsic or the intrinsic models were superior to the other with regard to learning outcomes. The study concluded that virtual presence was highest in conventional games without any type of support whatsoever. However, with support, we saw learning outcomes in various areas increased. So we know that learning support is important to development of these types of games. Let's get started with the critique. Now, first, I found that this article had good background information with a lot of citations. It had a clearly stated problem, both in the abstract and in the introduction. The variables were clearly labeled, and there was a review of literature of sorts in the introduction, but that's where the review ends. Now, looking at the abstract introduction, we see that the problem seems to be that there is not enough empirical data or evidence on which design variations of support influence learning and to what extent. So we don't know what types of support provide which types of influence in learning. It also seeks to provide some evidence and more breadth and body to the research, but it fails to do so, I think, in some ways because it has a small sample size of 138 or 135 as the article states. It's kind of some fuzzy math. I'll explain that later. Now, the demographics are Germans. Is there any diversity there? We don't know. It's not stated. And the scope of limitations are some of the things that also drive this research. The problem that they've formulated is researchable. The experiment that they've devised does seem to be sound and good to research the topic. In the introduction, there is some background information, as I mentioned previously, a short review of literature, but it's not specifically stated that way, and there isn't a full and thorough review of literature done in this article. And we know that the educational significance is. We need to know what types of variation of support impact our students and in which ways. And the variables are clearly stated. So we have virtual presence, cognitive learning, and learning outcomes. Now, as I've already mentioned, there is sort of a short review of literature within the introduction section, but there is not a drawn out section specifically for review of literature, which is kind of confusing because they have a number of different scholarly articles that are peer-reviewed scientific journals that they could easily have used for a review of literature. I don't know if it's something that's indicative of this certain type of educational journal. It is an international journal. Maybe that's not the practice, but this review of literature is something that would seriously have helped in understanding the situation more fully. Now, nearly all the sources that they cite are primary works and peer-reviewed scientific journals. While they may have critically analyzed some of the sources they use in their introduction, there's little evidence to support that they critically analyze all of them because there is no review of literature. I don't think I can hammer that home any more clearly. They need a review of literature in this so that we can get a critical look at the literature that they do have in their research background. Now, as I previously mentioned, the hypotheses are not clearly spelled out in the article, and you would expect to see something in a journal of this caliber, in a scientific journal, no less, but they are not clearly spelled out. So what I had to do was create my own hypotheses, most of them single-tailed hypotheses, drawn from the initial 2 research questions and the results that came out of the results and conclusion section, where they talked about things they hypothesized, but they never actually listed them. So again, this article would have been better served if it had clearly stated hypotheses. All the hypotheses that you've seen thus far are drawn from the 2 main research questions and the findings of the research. Now, I drew these out myself. Another key item with regard to the hypotheses that it would have indicated where the researchers expect to find significant results, in which direction, either a positive or negative impact. Let's talk about the method and subjects. Now, initially in the article, it states the size of the population tested was 135. But when you add the males and females together listed, it equals 138. That's fuzzy math for me, and that's where I have an issue. When you compare the size of the populations for the various 3 groups that they tested, however, it does come to 135. In no place in the article do they explain why that is. The major characteristics identified in the population were what you would expect from a middle school group. The method of selection for this research was purposeful. They sought to enlist members of the population group that had little to no experience with physics and little to no experience with the software. There were no volunteers in the study, and the size described is clear and its major characteristics are labeled. And as I mentioned previously about the test subjects, we don't know what their ethnic or cultural background is. This study takes place in Germany, but it's unknown whether this is a homogeneous group or a group with diversity. The other thing is that this sample size does meet the minimum requirement as set forth by our professor, but it's not a strong sample size. It is not large enough to create good solid numbers and reliability. Now, while the scales of the questionnaire instruments used in the study are listed in a chart format, as are the reliability coefficients of each of the scales, I don't find anything else discussed about the reliability or these scales within the text of the article. So that's an issue for me. I find that suspicious at best and misleading at worst. The issue in regards to the liability of questionnaires covering retention and transfer, though, are particularly egregious in my opinion, where the authors state that it is slightly below the accepted consistency of measurement. If something is below the consistency of measurement, that means that it's not a good tool. So they have to look at what causes that issue. I believe it's the sample size that is not large enough. But if they're using these in their research and they're stating these as findings, then those findings are flawed. As I previously mentioned, all the instruments were either created from scratch or adapted for the study from existing tools in the field. Now, the rationale behind each tool was explained, and they were explained in detail. I found that satisfactory. However, beyond the basic details, there's no granular information given in detail of these test instruments. And I find that's an issue because if this experiment is to be repeated, which that's what usually goes into a scientific journal, something that can be repeated, that information is needed. Looking at the design and procedure, I found that the experiment was appropriate and well suited to answering the research questions that they had. Remember those 2 research questions. The procedures described are explained, but not really in enough detail. Remember, we need to be able to repeat this experiment to ensure validity at a later date. Finally, with design and procedure, there are no confounding variables discussed or accounted for. But all in all, I did find the design and the study procedures conducted seem well matched to studying the research question. In the results section of this research article, I did find appropriate descriptive statistics presented in the results of the study. Probability levels for each of the results were specified in advance of the data analysis and an easy-to-read chart format, but it's hard to tell if every hypothesis was tested because, as I previously mentioned, there were only 2 research questions and no clearly stated hypotheses. In this article, I found the tests are interpreted using appropriate degrees of freedom, and the results are clearly presented throughout the results section. I also found that the 2 charts that were in this article were clearly written and organized. They were easy to understand, and the data presented is described in the text. Now in the discussion section, each result is discussed as if there was a previously mentioned hypothesis, but as I have mentioned numerous times throughout this review, there were no clearly stated hypotheses. And while there are a number of generalizations made in the discussion, I find that they're consistent with the results. Practical implications of the findings are also discussed and how these findings could be implemented in future research. One major finding was that learners with any kind of support, whether extrinsic or intrinsic, showed significantly greater gains on test scores for retention, comprehension, and near transfer. Another finding that did not support one of the research hypotheses was that none of the versions of the learning game thought to lower cognitive load actually did. So this means that the researchers felt that with any kind of external or internal support in a learning game, that the mental effort required for that game would be reduced, and in this case they found that was not the case. As previously mentioned, they found there was no significant difference in cognitive load generated by any of the learning game versions. They all had basically an equal cognitive load. Some future research that they mentioned, and I agree with, is that whether a learner's level of interest impacts whether a support device will increase their learning outcomes. So this case looked at novices using these different learning softwares, but they want to look at expert levels of learner and see how they make out. Another point that was drawn out in the conclusion, and I wholeheartedly agree with, is that the low number of participants they had may have had a negative effect on statistical power of the study. So, as I previously mentioned, their low sample size can be a negative impact on the overall research. Future research conducted in this area should be done with much greater sample sizes. Overall, I found this topic of study to be engaging. I thought it was timely. I think it's important for educators to see the ways that they can improve students and how they learn and their learning outcomes using educational software, especially educational games. I think that this study provides a little bit more empirical research and a few more paving stones on the road to understanding how we can best use support devices to serve our students. My greatest criticisms come from, obviously, the population size, the lack of clear, concise hypotheses, and the reliability of some of the research instruments. Again, this is an important topic and timely because we know that a lot of different types of technologies are being fast-tracked into education, and it's important for us as educators to understand what makes for effective educational technology and not look at educational technology to be the cure for what ails us in our educational woes.